Our next panel topic is technology and politics. Please welcome to the stage Senior Counsel at Apple, Sarita Venkat, and her esteemed panelists.
Great, I'm good.
I paid her to do that. Good morning, everyone. So we have the pleasure of the very last panel of the summit, and I thought about this panel and kind of pitching the politics and technology to the ChIPs board because, frankly, I just needed some therapy. And so I came up with all of these four amazing women who are going to tackle some of the issues that we've been seeing in technology and politics, and really generally how the impact of how our lives have been impacted by the social discourse on politics. So to my left is Karen Dunn. She's a partner at Boies Schiller. She's focused on high-profile civil litigations and trials, primarily for tech companies. Part of her practice is also doing crisis management. Earlier in her career, she served as a federal prosecutor, associate counsel to President Obama, and communications director to then Senator Hillary Clinton. In her volunteer time, she coaches political debates, including Obama in 2012 and Hillary in 2016. I also have Juleanna Glover. She is regularly included in publications lists of the most influential and powerful people in the nation's capital. She has served on the senior staffs of President-elect George W. Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and she has advised Senator John McCain in his bid for the White House and traveling with him throughout the 2008 presidential primary season. She's a corporate consultant at the Office of Juleanna Glover. And then we have Jamie Gorelick. She's a litigator who chairs the regulatory practice at WilmerHale here in DC. She's had a career in and out of government, serving at Justice, Defense, Energy, and on the 9/11 Commission. Long committed to pro bono service, she was a founder of the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless and currently chairs the board of the Urban Institute. From serving in the Clinton administration to representing Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, she has certainly served on both sides of the political aisle. And then we have Tekedra Mawakana, who leads global policy and government affairs for Waymo, formerly known as the Google self-driving car project. Prior to Waymo, Tekedra worked at the intersection of tech, law, and policy at eBay, Yahoo, and AOL, from Silicon Valley, where she is now, to as well as in DC, where she's lived majority of her career. She has been recognized as a tech titan by Washingtonian magazine. So welcome, everyone. You all are extremely intimidating to me right now, but we're so happy to have you all. So let's talk a little bit about the election in 2016, the days leading up to the election and afterwards. How has technology pervaded politics and vice versa? I'm going to start with you, Karen.
So I think that it's really hard to talk about this election without talking about the aftermath and what we now know about Russian interference in our election. But I think if we just cover that on this panel, we'll probably be doing the global topic a great disservice. It seems like about 10 years ago, I actually read an article that had this comment, I thought it was hilarious, which is that Washington, D.C.'s view of the tech world was which tech company CEO was most like Jesus and who was going to run for president. And what we are seeing now is an interplay between technology and politics that nobody has figured out. And I think most especially the people who have not figured it out are the people in Washington, D.C., the politicians who are really wrestling with how to deal with this. I think that at a certain point, D.C. looked at Silicon Valley sort of like, somebody that they thought was interesting to have a relationship with. You look sort of cute, you share my values, you like to innovate, that's sort of a mission-driven thing. We're very mission-driven here. And what is happening now is very much, they can't, the folks in DC kind of can't get away from the fact that technology is affecting their purview. So elections and policy and things that they would have rather stay away from and sort of think we're shiny at a distance. So when I think about this issue, I think that what this election is really forcing to have happen is a reckoning between the way that Washington views the tech community. And so even today, I, like a good Washington, D.C. ex-Politico, looked at my Axios, and turns out John McCain is joining Senator Warner, Senator Klobuchar in the Honest Ads legislation about mandating more disclosure for ads that are on social media. And Mike Allen predicts that this is just the beginning, and I think he's right. And I think that this is happening now, and certainly in DC we don't know how to cope, and I think it's possible that in Silicon Valley we don't yet know how to cope either. So that is what is on the horizon, in my view.
Juleanna?
So I'm going to talk about this from the narrative arc of sort of from starting point of a couple days before the election when everybody thought Hillary Clinton was going to win to probably right up until now. So when President Trump won the election, of course, everyone I worked for, as well as the tech community writ large, was of course stunned. The following week, you saw after the election, you saw some significant executives from the tech community go up to Trump Tower. First week of December, you saw that really very impressive roundtable of CEOs from the technology community, all gathered around with Jared, Ivanka, and the president. And I remember sort of hovering in the sort of the staff hall downstairs, and every EVP of every major company in the tech community that sort of had oversight in government relations was all there, and we were sort of milling around, trying to understand where this would end up, and such unknown sort of level of mystery as to how this administration would navigate tech. But what was understood foremost that information is power, and everyone needed to have a better understanding of who and how the various administration players would work. Fast forward to all of the committees and panels that were created, and then the slow diminution of CEOs walking away from the president, realizing, one, that there was this balance between what their consumers and their employees wanted versus sort of the concern about outraging an administration by declining to continue to participate. And watching how that worked through, I would encourage, like every single one of you who works at this intersection of politics and tech, it's important to study that history and that narrative arc, because we are in an age now where precedent means nothing. In the next couple presidential elections, we could see things that could be just as extraordinary that have happened last year. And all of us need to be much more prudential in terms of how we manage our relationships with any executive branch. And I think we probably need to work a little bit more closely among each other as we manage through what a unified front on the technology community is to an administration, a new administration in particular.
Take it away, Jamie.
I would take that arc a little bit further back. And it's my observation, and I don't know if it has resonance with those of you in the room, that technology companies, certainly ones that I've advised and ones I've met with, really didn't think they had much they wanted to do with Washington. If they could keep it at a distance, they would, until in the last couple of years, they started to realize that something that could be done in Washington could move their business model from black to red in no time. That the way in which they manage financial risk and operational risk and all the other risks had to be applied to managing policy risk. And then you come to what happened after the election, which was it was an earthquake for everyone, but certainly for technology companies, which had just kind of gotten a little bit comfortable dealing with Democrats. And all of a sudden, you not only had a Republican hegemony in Washington, but you had a real unknown in the president and in the people around him. And that's what, so as Karen said, DC was not quite fully engaged with, didn't quite understand technology, but the opposite was true as well, that technology companies were very uneven in their engagement with Washington. So then you get to the scenario that Juliana just described, where all of a sudden that unease has to be expressed in some kind of decision making. Do you participate in one of these groups and panels? Do you engage? Do you give to the inaugural when you haven't given to the campaign? Do you join one of these groups? And the tension that Juliana describes between wanting to engage, assuming this is the government we have and that policies and practices that it adopts will have real impact on the business models of so many companies on the one hand, and then the kinds of things that Sally Yates was talking about in the last panel, where particularly the engineering community just recoiled on issues like immigration, put our business leaders in a very, very difficult position, which they are still navigating to this day. And I think that will continue. You can't pull out entirely. You can't just say, well, we're off on the West Coast and we don't need to engage. If you fully jump in, there are all kinds of ramifications. And so the navigation of this for most technology companies is very, very challenging. And some companies are better positioned than others, but I think all of them recognize that if, for example, legislation were to percolate which turns certain technologies into utilities, you could have a profound effect, not just on individual companies, but on the whole way in which our economy, particularly in the technology area, which has been so vibrant, progresses in the next decades to come. So I think the discussion we're having today could be entertaining, but it's also pretty profound in the implications for all of us in this room.
Yes, absolutely. And Tekedra, being in a Silicon Valley technology company, how do you feel the engagement has changed, and how do you best deal with that?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, and thank you for having me here today. I think it's interesting just to think about this idea of an arc. I have a slightly different perspective, I think, having been inside technology companies for this sort of last 20 plus years. I think if I think about communications platforms, because technology companies is sort of a big term, but if we think about what's happening today with these sort of hearings that you alluded to, Karen, and this focus on social media platforms, I think the sort of awakening moment for technology companies was really when Section 230 became the big battle between sort of Northern California and Southern California, right? Hollywood and Silicon Valley. And so that was a wake-up call, in my experience, for the Northern California technology companies. Like, if we don't build a collective, unified, and cohesive voice to figure out how to address policymakers in DC, we will lose. And so that was, for me, the first moment that this sort of arc begins. And then I think the second moment was in May of 2013, and the panel earlier talked about it, and that was, or June of 2013, and that was when Edward Snowden released the documents, and I was at Yahoo at the time, and that was a moment for the technology sort of community, because all of a sudden, what you acquire as a service provider became in the purview of government interest, and it became public. And so complying with the law was no longer enough. And so it was this real question around, like, how do you talk about these issues when there isn't permission to talk about these issues, and how do you defend your brands when people love their platforms that they use? So for me, that was the second moment where California really struggled with Washington, D.C. in very explicit ways. And there were a lot of, President Obama called CEOs constantly to the White House to deal with these issues. And so I really saw the engagement level of companies that had sat on the sidelines, weren't interested, no thank you. They didn't have a choice because consumer trust is sort of the ultimate currency for their brands. And then leading into the Trump election, the lead up to that, obviously politics were very divisive. And when President Trump won, I think I witnessed a lot of Silicon Valley, very senior executives express a lot of disappointment openly and loudly about the election results. And for me in particular, it was challenging because a big part of my job has been navigating, sort of without regard to whether the House or the Senate is Democrat or Republican, it's actually figuring out who's going to invest sort of the time and energy in the platform that's going to further the business objectives. And so I thought to myself, oh, this will be fine, right? Like, this is an administration who sort of ran on really wanting American innovation to lead. And there isn't a better example of American innovation than the technology industry. And so I just maintained mostly an optimistic view going into that first few weeks. We only got, I think, about a week before the travel ban, the first one. So it was challenging because with that travel ban, it sort of set the tone that if technology companies had a lot of people from other nations in their ranks, that this was not going to be the regular policy debate anymore. And so I found the ability to focus on the issues that are core to the business to be much more challenging. So for me, that's my biggest takeaway post-election, is it was no longer about the issues that the business cares about. It was more about the issues that the businesses were going to be forced to care about.
That's a very interesting perspective. I mean, so following up on that, how have you all, as a consultant and being within law firms advising major companies on social issues, everything from immigration to healthcare to the NFL, how do you advise companies or executives on these hot button topics that they may feel personally about, that they may or may not want to actually engage on social media or with their consumer bases that may have vastly different political views? Karen?
So what I have found is something that Jamie alluded to, so I assume she's seeing it as well, which is that our clients and people we talk to are trying to figure out how they square what their consumers want them to do, what their employees want to do, and what their business objectives are. And that is extremely difficult. I actually think we got off on a weird foot with the Trump administration because the first thing was the travel ban and the immigration issue.
Did you say weird foot?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I can explain that. Here's
okay,
why. So the immigration issue is something that is very close to both the business and the heart of many companies in Silicon Valley. So it's not hard to imagine why there were such strong feelings as a policy. And the travel ban was imposed in what I think everybody at this point agrees was a regretful way. And it was first. So there was this perfect storm that led to many technology companies and many CEOs taking a very public stand. Now, the question is that going to be the norm? And I think the jury is still out, but we have really not seen something similar to what happened with immigration. So when I talk to companies, what they're worried about is, in the absence of something so obvious, how do they navigate this? And this has to do with their personal feelings, their political beliefs, their consumers, who's buying their products, and also it comes up through the employees. And that's very difficult. And I think it depends on who the CEO is and who the company is, what advice you give them. But I think this is very tricky. I also think in general, just to pick up on a thread from earlier, Silicon Valley has a few things going for it vis-a-vis Washington, which is that much like Silicon Valley didn't want to engage Washington, Washington never really wanted to reach out and engage Silicon Valley in a way that would cabinet. And so I just think people who work at companies and who advise CEOs, it really should be in your mind that you have a leg up in that Washington is kept at bay because the public image of Silicon Valley as being the best American business, driven by innovation and new ideas, and consumers love the products, that is something that is leverage for the people in this room dealing with legislators. But at the same time, you can't be just reactive. It can't be today just about Russian interference in the election. It really has to be about taking the forward foot and thinking about what is our agenda, where can we compromise so that these folks understand that we're working with them. And I think that is part of the balance. The greater corporate agenda is part of the balance of when people think about what stands they're going to take on particular policy issues.
This fall we've seen a really remarkable trend, which is CEOs are now viewed as sort of the corporate conscience of America. Following all of the events of this summer, you saw this sort of piling on of events that many people, the majority of America, found to be very upsetting. And now, each individual CEO, if they have a high-profile company, they have to very carefully weigh their employee interests, their personal views, and their business interests. But the most important element of that is going to be the CEO's own views. I found that there's such a remarkable degree of overcorrection on Capitol Hill and among the media for leaders that are trying to be authentically moral and good. And sometimes that can be just words that are mouthed. But if a CEO or a company has some brand equity that they've stood for what's right previously, right now it's expected that those CEOs and those community leaders stand up and be brave when they see something that's outrageous. And although this is fraught with, especially for companies that do business with the government, fraught with various different types of landmines, I'm not sure that really any instance where our current president has held up a specific CEO or a company as a whipping boy or girl, that there's really been that much damage done to the company per se. There might have been, a short-term stock hit, but either the lobbying apparatus that came in afterwards, or the relationship building, knitting back into the agencies, or professional staff that mattered on both the Hill and in the administration. I'd be hard pressed to think of anybody right now who I think has really been truly damaged. I can think of CEOs that have, some scalps that have been taken, but it was more due to other aggregate events about them, and they also happened to step in it on these particular events. But again, the CEOs now do have there's a societal mandate that they speak up when they feel it is right. But following right on that, let's be clear, it's much better not to be in the news on this. I'm not going to name them, but there are a number of phenomenal companies out there that are huge iconic brands that we've really not heard about within this back and forth with the White House and the rest of the world. If there's a way to just, for a company to a CEO make a quiet stance to employees on what they think is right, and not have that be covered on the front page of the New York Times, that's maybe the best way for some corporations to operate.
I would make two comments. First is, Karen is absolutely right that technology companies have a leg up on most other companies in that consumers really like what technology does for them. And it's very personal to them, they interact with it, and so the image of our tech companies is excellent. However, the Russia investigation and other things are putting big chinks in that armor, in my view. And I think this is a very dangerous moment for technology generally, because anytime anything becomes pervasive in people's lives, they tend to have fear of that enterprise. And I don't need to tell the people in this room how pervasive technology is in people's lives, and there are worries that come with it, whether it is from the Snowden revelations or the issues that have surfaced about Russia's use of various technology platforms, or lots of other things. And you could imagine a left-right agreement that these companies are too big, too unregulated, that they need to have greater regulatory structure, that they need to be turned into utilities. So I think we are at a moment here when the technology community needs to really think strategically about how to deal with that, because the strengths have protected it so far, but I don't think that protection is immutable. And so I would be concerned about that. Second, the role of the company in responding to various actions that are taken by the government. I think Juliana is absolutely right that you have to have in your senior leadership a moral core, but my advice would be to very carefully calibrate whether you speak on an issue or you don't, and the modality for doing it. You know, if every company that has a disagreement with, for example, the administration, goes into the group of companies that are kind of no-go for the federal government, you'd have everybody in that category right now, and clearly that is not the case. I think it takes a lot to make a company completely toxic, but I think, so therefore, taking a point of view on an issue that is near and dear to your heart, near and dear to your employees, near and dear to your business model, I think is very important to do. But I would not set as an expectation for a CEO or senior leadership that you speak out on every issue, that you become the moral voice on every issue. The one comment I would make that is, to me, the most interesting is how important the employee base, and particularly engineers, are to the decision-making of companies. I once asked a company represented here in this room why it was taking a position that I considered to be so counter to our national security. And it arose in the context of the Snowden revelations and the backlash. And he said, our engineers would kill us otherwise. And I thought, boy, that is, I hear you, but you cannot be driven that way. You have to take into consideration all the different equities and not reflexively respond to any one of them. I get it, but it is a worry that I have.
Can I add something brief to what Jamie said? Because I think it's really important everybody hear this, which is the fact that people in DC are even talking about any regulation of the technology sector, when even if you go back just to last year, the goal was to let the tech sector figure out any problems on its own, including problems that brought it up against law enforcement. Washington said, no, you guys in Silicon Valley, you deal with that and figure out how to fix this problem. So the fact that it is now today acceptable to talk about serious regulation of the tech sector really ought to be, as Jamie says, an incredible wake-up call to all of us. Because once you break that glass, it really is, it's acceptable. There's no going back. And that's happening. That's where we are right now. So I just want to amplify. All of us in this room who care about this are at a very important moment where we have to really reflect, what do we want the future to look like, not on this one issue, but globally for the regulated future of something that so far has not really been within the control of Washington.
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that. I agree. And I think just sort of from the perspective of all of us thoughtful people in this room and a room full of people, is one thing that isn't sort of posited often in this conversation about the role of tech companies in any of these actions that turn out to be government related is, how much responsibility should the tech companies bear for third-party activities, and how much of a conversation should we be having about the government's role in supporting the technology companies? And this was the same conversation that happened during Edward Snowden, and it's the conversation that I'm imagining is going to happen again, which is it okay for these platforms to become basically the proxy for government-to-government activity? Because that's what's happening again, and that's what's happened before. It's not a conversation that the technology companies can engage in by themselves. It's a conversation that other stakeholders will engage in. And I know that during the Snowden times, there were a lot of stakeholders, free speech advocates, human rights advocates from around the world who came to bear, or who came to the defense of the technology companies, not because they really have this love and passion for the companies per se, but because the free speech platform is something that they valued. And so I think there's going to be something very similar in this, where similarly situated third-party stakeholders are going to say, keep your hands off this platform because it provides something societally that I value. I think what's scary sort of in this moment in time is it's not clear that we have a government that is aligned with those values, so it's less clear for everyone.
Yeah. And that leads me to my next question, which is, we have a lot of social media companies that are set to testify on the Hill on what their obligations should be. What do you all think about? Do you think that social media companies should have ethical obligations when it comes to curating social behavior or government interference or any of those issues that are percolating right now?
Let me pop in. So I work for the news media industry, and they are fighting the quasi-duopoly of Google and Facebook, as we like to call it. And I don't think that anyone anticipated in previous years that those two companies would so dominate how we communicate, but also how one makes money off of content. And I think it's not necessarily a function, it doesn't always have to be a function of more regulation. There's maybe a move afoot to have it be a function of less regulation, in the sense you could allow a antitrust safe harbor to allow the content providers to negotiate, to quote, collude, to negotiate en masse against the platforms. So, but like all of this is, indeed so new, the idea that Congress would sort of, having to acclimate the idea that you would have to do something about these big, ubiquitous entities. We are in no man's land, and we are going to have to think really carefully about how those regulations are put in place, because we are, we're regulating the future, and, as we see now, we're not quite as prescient as we would like to be.
So I would, again, make two comments. Number one, what's happening to this industry is the same thing that has happened to every industry that has had a really important impact on individuals' lives. I mean, I've been doing this for over 4 decades. This is not new. The only thing that's new is it's happening here. Yeah. So the playbook, which is actually a pretty good playbook, is you self-regulate. You figure out what the standards should be, and you try to adopt them yourselves so as to forestall somebody putting probably worse, less effective, less efficient regulations on you. If you don't do that, if you try to stiff arm, you will get an equal and opposite reaction, and it is a bad idea. The technology companies that own our means of communication that are so pervasive right now, they know better than anyone else what tools they could bring to the table. And I think you're hearing that, you're seeing that, and I think that is the right way to go. There's a very strong libertarian core in Silicon Valley. And I understand that. And it basically says, stay away, government. Other industries have had the same, other industries have had the same problem, which is that they Is this on?
Yeah, we can hear.
Which is that they would like the government to stay out of their business. But it doesn't work just to stiff arm. And so I would suggest thinking about, in a very responsible, citizen-like way, how can we make this better? So I would really focus on that. Let me stop there.
Okay. Karen, did you have anything?
Well, I substantially agree with Jamie. I mean, I find it hard to think about this.
I found agreement in Washington, D.C.
Although I don't know if this is.
I'm on with that one too.
But I always think of the line from SpiderMan, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think long before we saw the moment we're having today, where the tech companies are as powerful as they are, it was pretty clear that they were occupying a space where they were able to reach more people through the platforms than even our government can reach. And so I am very in sync with Jamie, which is that if tech waits for DC to do something that understands to a granular level the technology and what goes into the technology, we're going to be waiting for a long time, and a longer time than it will take for them to feel that they need to do something. So it is a sort of old story, but I think hopefully we can inspire people to lean in, as it were.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I agree with what you've both said. I would probably, not surprisingly, reframe it a little bit to say, what more can they do? I think the responsible, very well-known technology brands have been doing a lot for a long time. I think whether we're talking about beheadings during the ISIS sort of period, which Senator Feinstein was very focused on, I mean, there are concerted efforts to ensure that heinous acts and crimes aren't committed on platforms, because it doesn't help build trust, doesn't grow businesses, and it's not good. So I don't think there's any fundamental disagreement. I think the disagreement comes to who should invest in the technology development needed to solve problems that no one knew existed. And I think that's the issue. And so I think if the decision is, if you don't know it exists and we find out it happened, then we're going to regulate you, then I don't know that that leaves a lot of room for actually getting to the solution to the problem, if we agree that the problem is having elections hijacked by foreign nations. So I think there's such a temptation to focus on this in a way that presumes a level of knowledge and understanding. Engineers can know everything about what a product is intended to do and what a platform is intended to do. That doesn't mean they're deploying the technology needed to detect everything else that is happening unbeknownst to them. And I think it's that disconnect in the conversation that normally leads to more of a divisive discussion than is needed, because everyone wants to solve the issue. No one wants the activity on the platforms.
Yeah, but that's where, this is out of the hands of engineers and in the hands of corporate leaders. The corporate leadership knows what their technology is capable of doing and needs to anticipate, I think, criticism. When you look at what happened with the banks. I mean, the banks could have themselves avoided a lot of the regulation that came raining down on them if they had been a little more, if they leaned into it a little more. And you could go through each industry. Pharmaceuticals, for example. I mean, I could list all of them, and these things have come in waves. I would like to just put one other point in, which is, what should the relationship between the government and these companies be? Again, ever since Snowden, the technology companies have said, we need to have distance from the government. I mean, it used to be, before, right in the aftermath of 9/11, 2001, companies would come to us and say, I've been asked to do this for the government, may I do it? Is it appropriate? Is it legal? And now they come to us and they say, I've been asked to do this for the government, do I have to? And that is a very big change. Now, I would say that if the federal government, and let's just say the FBI, cannot warn a company using its best intelligence about how that company is being used by a foreign enemy, we're in a bad place. And I think I know this is wishful thinking on my part, but I'm an optimistic person. I think that for our national security, there needs to be a more constructive dialogue between those who are responsible for our national security in the government and the owners of the platforms on which our national security rests.
So there was a headline today I read it and I thought, oh God, that's bad. So there's
Just one.
But yeah,
Which one?
just one. There's just one specific to today. I mean, usually it's my entire Twitter feed, but the headline was, companies facing new regulation, and then the next bullet was they have an army of lobbyists, and in this age where there is so much animosity, and you do have these companies, the technology community is by and large perceived to be an improvement in people's lives. They are beloved brands. The idea that you're going to have an army that goes to war on Capitol Hill to stop some sort of regulation, the positioning, I just thought to myself, oh, that is not going to end well. I mean, when you say dialogue's the crucial, Jamie, dialogue is the crucial element here. I mean, Facebook and Google didn't anticipate or, understand contemporaneously, I don't believe, what was happening on their platforms, in the weeks before the election. But, and as they came to learn more about it, within this really sort of hothouse, painful political environment right now, I believe that they've done what they could to be as, forthright, and I don't ascribe any degree of malice to them whatsoever. But no technology company right now, absent a serious antitrust review and going into litigation, should be thinking that they need to go to war on Capitol Hill, because it's not at all a good disposition to be having, especially in an environment where people are hungry to just kind of do what's right now. I think there's a sentiment to overcorrect in this world where so many of us are so concerned about the direction of the country.
And given that divisive environment, do you all feel that we're going to reach some sort of a time frame where we start that dialogue? Or do you see it getting better? Are you seeing changes since the election that give you hope that maybe perhaps we could be a bit more united than I feel that we are as a country?
the trends are not.
Silence. This is not the therapy
The
session I was
trends are
hoping
not
for.
good.
Yeah.
We are but the two parties are being driven to their polls, which
Right.
is really bad.
And since this is a conversation about technology, I mean, look, on my Twitter feed, everyone supports climate change. And there are many people out there who are looking at their social media platforms, and they are not even aware that these divergent views exist.
That there's a whole other Twitter platform that somebody else is seeing that is exactly opposite of the climate change
Exactly.
support that you're seeing on your Twitter feed.
Exactly. So in a way, we're becoming more polarized. And you could imagine an alternative universe where actually the ability to get around the mainstream media would help an insurgent candidate that had more universal support. So maybe one day we will see that, and that will be the byproduct of having these platforms. But right now, we are in an incredibly divisive moment in our history, and it is, we're starting to see blame cast about basically to all quarters of assisting in the polarization of our society. So I think we can be optimistic in repeating something Juleanna said, which is we're in an unpredictable world, and that 4 years from now may be very different from right now. We obviously didn't see this coming very well. But right now, I think we're all seeing an incredible amount of polarization. And probably the only people who are extremely happy are the banks, who now are not in the news at all. And if you looked pre-election, every day there was a negative article about the banks as being the worst corporate entity in America. And their unfavorables were way high. You want to look good, you mentioned the banks. Now, where are they? You do not see them. So
You know, Tekedra, oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I am picking up there is a phenomenon where there is sort of a rising center, particularly on Capitol Hill. I mean, you do have your absolute diehard Trump defenders, and then you have, on the left, you have, the coterie of folks that are going to be much harder to deal with. But my sincere advice to anyone having any particular existential threat or concern in Washington right now is seek out the smartest, most principled, the individuals who have had, extraordinarily successful endeavors prior to, what's happening in our world now. Because, I am convinced that, the smart, moral, principled ones will win out in the end, and if not, we're all going to be in a fetal position
We
in
love
a
your
couple of years.
optimism.
But that again, you'll go into meetings on Capitol Hill, and you'll walk out, and you will have left a business card for some member you may not have dealt with before, and get a call from a fundraiser 10 minutes later. Don't deal with that member again, or figure out a way to understand that particular there's a challenge in sort of the views and attitudes of the staff or the member in that office, and really build the best, strongest relationships with those people that you can bank on doing what they believe to be, or making the best decision based on the facts available to them at that moment. There are so many still out there like that, and there are future on both sides of the aisle.
That's really good advice. Thank you. Did you want to add to that, Jamie, or no? I thought you were trying to say something. Tekedra, from an in-house perspective, you lead a team of lawyers that are doing public policy. How do you ensure that there's an inclusive environment when people have polarizing views on political issues that you can't escape every day?
Yeah, so that's been, I think, a really unique sort of challenge, especially after this election. I wasn't at my current company, but working for a Silicon Valley-based company, having President Trump win, having sort of the whole valley erupt into collective sobs, and then having people on my team who I'd hired in different parts of the world because of their political affiliation, because of their sort of savviness in dealing with different stakeholders, labor parties, whoever, and really thinking about how to make sure that I can be a part of creating an inclusive environment for all political views, and recognizing that day after the election that I probably had about 3 or 4 people on my team who didn't want to come to work that day, and not because their candidate lost, but because their candidate won, and they didn't want to be in rooms where everyone would presume only an idiot would have voted that way, were the things that were being said. And so I've really taken my position at the table with my CEO's leadership team at that time and now and before to remind people that this is an opportunity for inclusion, and there are views that are not shared by all of Silicon Valley, and that making sure that those employees feel that their sort of values are valued by the company, I think it's been really important. And part of that, I just reach out to those individuals. And this one guy, he broke down into tears, and he said to me, I did not want to even return. If his wife had worked in the previous administration, so she wasn't working anymore. And he's like, if she had a job, I would have quit. I couldn't imagine waking up and going to work at a tech company at this point in my career, knowing how unwelcome that I feel. And so I shared that story sort of broadly and widely, and think it's been somewhat of an ironic, because I think sometimes I'm in these situations where I'm the one saying hey, the conservative guy who voted for Trump needs a seat at the table, and people are like, wait, you're a woman, you're black, what's going on? But I think it's a characteristic that has helped me in my career, which is to be able to remember that at each seat around the table, people have experiences that are different than mine, and I've certainly been the person whose experiences were not understood by anyone in the room. And so really channeling that to be able to support my team has been really important.
That's really, really awesome. Let me switch gears a little bit. How have your lives as lawyers and consultants changed in the type of work that you do? representing companies or the issues that you've decided to take on. And I'm going to talk first to Karen because, as I understand it, you just filed a complaint. That's very interesting to me.
Yeah, so my general practice has changed quite a lot in the advice I'm asked to give, but another thing that's going on is within law firms there, and probably everywhere, there is a desire to wade into the political discourse in a way where we can also be advocates. So last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, I filed a complaint against 26 individuals and organizations of neo-Nazis and white supremacists responsible for the violence in Charlottesville. And thank you. Wish us good luck. So our clients are 11 people who were harmed or injured in Charlottesville by the events on Friday night at the Rotunda and Saturday night having to do with the rally in Charlottesville, 2 of whom were injured by the car that killed Heather Heyer, and one of whom I just have to say is a remarkable story. He pushed his fiancée out of the way of the car. And they both are plaintiffs, and they actually both have spoken publicly already. These people are so courageous. And you know, we went to Charlottesville to talk to them. I'm doing this suit with Robbie Kaplan, who won the Windsor case in the Supreme Court. And we went there to talk to the plaintiffs, and they said, we just can't do nothing. We want to find a way to fight back. And there have to be limits on what people are allowed to do to us. And I will also say that a tremendous amount of our evidence in this case is going to come off the internet and off the chat boards, which established conclusively that this was a pre-planned conspiracy to do violence. So, you know, I know that there are so many people in this room doing similar work to what we are doing, and you know, some of what we said today is not terribly optimistic, but I just want to impart that if you spent 10 minutes with the people in Charlottesville who are so brave and courageous and not going to stand for hate and for evil, you would be inspired.
That's great.
I would just add to that. You know, this is a moment in time when the courts are one of the bulwarks of our society, and seeking justice is really important to the esprit de corps in our own law firms and our own institutions. We filed the first successful suit that stopped dead in its tracks the regulation of sanctuary cities on behalf of Chicago. And while, you know, I won't go into detail about it, and as Karen says, this is happening in law firms all around the country. It is, you know, lawyers, the people in this room are capable and responsible for shoring up the institutions of our society. And it has given a lot of people a sense of purpose, and it is one rejoinder to the sense of the unsettling sense of chaos that people feel. So I think it's important for each of us to challenge our organizations to do that.
Thank you for that. And with that, I'm told we're running out of time. We have run out of time. So this has been the most interesting topic to me. And so thank you so much for all of your wise words and a sense of hope that I absolutely do have. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Guys, I think we're supposed to do this.